This is Jed Disler, and welcome to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Actually, this episode is not going to be so much about recordings as it will be about pianists. But I will put in some links to recordings in our episode description, where you will also see a link where you can subscribe to this podcast via my Piano Maven Substack page. And I really do hope you consider taking out a subscription, because that will keep us having this podcast going and being in production. Do you ever see these fan magazines about celebrities when they have articles that are on the topic of whatever happened to, meaning somebody who was once kind of super famous, but then faded from the scene? This happens a lot in classical music. When a certain performer starts to get a lot of attention, either after winning a competition, or else they have a strong publicity machine behind them. But then after a certain period of time, you don't hear about this performer anymore. Or more accurately, these performers are nowhere near so publicized as they were in the earlier part of their career. So I thought I could pick 12 pianists who might be good subjects for a Whatever Happened To article in People magazine. Well, maybe not People magazine, maybe in some piano magazine or Gramophone, or I don't know. But I put this list together of pianists who did get a lot of attention back in the proverbial day, and you never hear about them anymore. So let's begin with number one on my list, the Belarusian pianist Leonid Kuzmin. Back in the late 1990s, or mid to late 1990s, he recorded quite a bit for the Russian compact disc label. Do you remember that label? It had blue background. I think it was white print and a blue masthead or something like that. Anyway, his discs were getting reviewed quite a bit. And one of his American sponsors was the musicologist and writer Joseph Maklis. And Joseph Maklis wrote this best-selling textbook called The Enjoyment of Music, and he made piles of money on that book. And Joe Maklis would often host concerts or parties in this penthouse apartment on East 57th Street, I think it was, because I went to a bunch of those parties. And I think he kept this apartment specifically for these social events. Anyway, Kuzmin was a real virtuoso who reveled in flashy repertoire, and a lot of critics thought he was talented, but musically he was green as grass. And that was true in certain ways, but he certainly could get around the keyboard, and some critics also called him a pianist with all fingers and no brain, which was understandable, but not quite fair. But I've enjoyed some of the recordings. Some of them are outrageously glib, but I've been looking all over the internet, and I cannot find the whereabouts of Kuzmin anywhere. Did he keep up his career, but with a much lower profile than he had in the 90s? Or did he give up playing? Is he alive? Is he dead? I really would like to know what happened to Leonid Kuzmin. If you know, then please let me know, let all of us know. Unfortunately, in regard to the second pianist on this list, what happened to the 1989 Van Cliburn competition gold medalist, Alexei Sultanov, turned out to be a long and drawn-out tragedy. At the age of 19, he won the Cliburn competition, and he quickly became a superstar overnight. He got a flood of engagements, and he had this kind of daredevil style of playing that critics loved to hate. And after several helter-skelter years on the platform, Sultanov tried to focus himself more And in 1995, he shared second prize at the Warsaw Chopin competition. There wasn't a first prize given in that year. And he would record here and there. And he had a particularly faithful following in Japan, where he made some CDs that were not published outside that country. But in 2001, Alexei Sultanov suffered a series of very serious, debilitating strokes that quickly put an end to his career, although he heroically fought to survive and to heal for several years before death finally overtook him in 2005. A very sad end to a meteoric yet kind of troubled career. The third pianist on my list is the Greek pianist Dimitris Sigouris. In 1982, when he was 13, he started to get tons of attention. I remember very vividly when he made this big splash playing the Rachmaninoff Third Concerto with the National Symphony Orchestra, and Rostropovich was conducting. This was at Carnegie Hall. And I remember in November 1982, he gave this super long concert in New York. It was his solo debut. But also on this solo debut, the violinist Eric Friedman had a guest shot, and he joined Dimitris Sigouris to play the Franck Sonata. I think this program was like 3 hours, and basically the 13-year-old pianist played fast and loud. But a few months before he died, Arthur Rubinstein got to hear Sigouris in private at Rubinstein's home, and he wrote or was quoted in saying that, "I thank God for keeping me alive so that I would be able to hear with my own ears Sigouris play. He is the best pianist I have ever heard, including myself." And then Rubinstein took off his gold watch and he put it in Sigouris's wrist as if passing on the torch, I imagine. And then 2 months after their meeting, Rubinstein died. Anyway, Sigouris, as a teenager, went on to record several releases for EMI. His debut disc coupled the Brahms Paganini variations and the Schumann symphonic etudes. And there was an all-list disc. There was a Rachmaninoff Third with the Berlin Philharmonic. I think there may have been one other disc. I honestly can't remember. And then basically this pianist disappeared from the limelight. Although, if you look at his website, he did go on to have a busy and quite respectable career as an adult, performing and recording worldwide. But he never quite got the same attention as an adult that he got as a teenager. The fourth pianist on my list is Max Levinson. I don't know if anyone remembers when he started to get all this press attention in the late 1990s when he recorded 2 solo piano discs for a label called Encoded Music. And his career was launched when he won first prize at the Dublin International Piano Competition. And back then, I remember there were some publicists who were really pushing me to review these discs. And these discs were quite excellent. They still are. One had Schumann's Papillon, Brahms' variations on an original theme, the 6 little pieces, Opus 19 by Schoenberg, and Leon Kirchner's 5 pieces for piano. And the other disc was an all Bartók release. Both of these discs were exceptionally well recorded, and I still enjoy these discs because Max Levinson was clearly a pianist who channeled his considerable virtuosity toward musical ends. Now, I don't think he disappeared so much as that I personally lost track of him. Yet Max Levinson performs and teaches and has a very fulfilling musical life. He's chair of the piano department at the Boston Conservatory, and he's also a faculty member at the New England Conservatory. So he is really doing quite well and performing and teaching and I'm not really sure what's happening with him in terms of recordings, but certainly he's not getting the attention that he got when those two solo CDs were released in the 90s. Another pianist, this is the fifth one on my list, who got lots of attention when she recorded several discs for Decca in the early 2000s, is Naida Cole. I actually first heard her on a disc of highlights from the 1997 Van Cliburn competition. And then I reviewed her Decca releases for ClassicsToday.com. I liked her first disc a lot. It had wonderful performances of Fauré's Ballade, Opus 19 in the solo piano version, and some really terrific Chabrier. Although I found her Ravel Gaspard de la Nuit uneven, rather cold in some ways. And her second release had a very good, if, again, I use the word cold, performance of Ravel's Miroir. I mean, it's absolutely rock solid technically. And then there was a very direct and uncluttered and really scintillating Liszt sonata on this disc, and I hadn't thought about it in years. And before I started to record this episode, I listened to it again, and I really, really liked it a lot. I think it deserves to be reissued. But what happened to Naida Cole? I'll tell you what happened to her. In 2007, she gave up her piano career to become a doctor, believe it or not. And she is assistant professor in the Department of Anesthesia and Critical Care at the University of Chicago. Now, speaking of the Cliburn competition and the sixth pianist on this list, André Michel Schub got a lot of attention when he won the 1981 Cliburn Gold Medal. He made 3 solo albums for Vox on their Vox Cum Laude label. I guess that was a step up from regular Vox, It's kind of like Economy Plus, The debut disc had Brahms' Handel variations and the Liszt Paganini etudes. It was a very fine disc, actually. There was a second solo release with 2 Beethoven sonatas, and there was a third disc that had the Schubert Wanderer Fantasy, the Chopin F minor Fantasy, and Mendelssohn's Fantasy in F-sharp minor, which was a work that wasn't recorded all that much at that time. So after the initial fuss and publicity machine died down after André Michel Schub won the Cliburn, basically he's had a very stable musical life as a soloist and as an exemplary chamber music player. I don't think he ever became a superstar on the level that people expected, but he's been active on a world-class level for decades, and probably it's healthier to have this kind of busy yet non-pressured and artistically fulfilling life. And I can speak from experience because I think I have a similar kind of musical life, and more power to André Michel Schub. The seventh pianist on my list is Frederick Chu. If I was assembling this list purely on the basis of recorded output and a pianist's profile in terms of his or her association with a label and how that label promotes that pianist and also critical consensus, then I would put Frederick Chu on this list as a definite whatever happened to candidate. But the fact is that Frederick Chu is as active as he has ever been. He's in demand as a performer, as a teacher, and a jury member, and he is still playing fabulously at full capacity. He's been very involved with bringing innovative ways to incorporate technology into teaching. The thing is that he rarely records anymore. But back in the 1990s, he entered into a relationship with Harmonia Mundi that yielded some fantastic releases, and they were all exceptionally well recorded. There was a complete Chopin Mazurka cycle. There was an excellent disc of Schubert songs transcribed by Liszt. There was some fabulous Ravel. He did a wonderful miroir. Speaking of miroir, his is one of the best in the catalog. And he also made what I think is the best overall survey on disc of Prokofiev's complete solo piano music. Again, this is someone who, just because he is less visible on disc than he was 30 years ago, that doesn't mean he's not making a living or not having a diverse and productive and busy and fulfilling musical life. Far from it. Now, if I was doing this podcast in the year 2000 rather than 2025, we'd certainly be able to do an article about whatever happened to Ivo Pogorelich. Now, we do know what happened to him because he's back on the scene. But you know the story. You know about how he was controversially eliminated from the 1980 Chopin competition and how Martha Argerich resigned in protest from the jury. She called him a genius and all that. And then Pogorelich went on to become the most talked about and possibly polarizing pianist of his generation. And I've talked about Pogorelich a lot on this podcast. Remember I did an episode in the first season about his amazing May 1990 Carnegie Hall concert? That's the stuff of legends. Anyway, after his wife and mentor, Elisa Kezheraja, died in 1996, Pogorelich basically dropped out of sight. And I never will forget when he made a comeback in 2006 to give his first New York concert in 10 years. It was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I wasn't at the concert, but very soon after the concert, I heard a bootleg recording, which I don't have anymore in my collection, but I vividly remember a good friend of mine bringing it over, and oh my God, I was in shock. Anthony Tomasini's scathing review in the New York Times was mercilessly accurate. And the playing was just totally incoherent and weird and formless. And basically, Pogorelich has been off the cliff ever since, artistically speaking, reaching the point of no return. And his 2 solo CDs for Sony Classical, released in 2019 and 2022, are equally perverse and really, really strange. The next pianist on this list of whatever happened to ... fill in the blank is the French pianist François-René Duchâble. When he first came on the scene in the 1970s, he got a lot of support and encouragement from Arthur Rubinstein, and he made many recordings for Erato and EMI. And then in 2003, he made an announcement that he was giving up concerts and he was going to retreat from the international concert limelight by hiring a helicopter to drop a piano into Lake La Colmiane near Nice in France. I don't know if that actually happened. I know that he announced that he was going to do that, but I didn't see any news reports about that happening. And what happened to François-René Duchâble ever since 2003? I have looked up and down the internet, but maybe I haven't researched it enough or done the kind of deep research that I should be doing. So if you can fill me in on whatever happened to François-René Duchâble, I would really love to know. And the final pianist on my whatever happened to list, actually this list is less than 12 pianists, I take it back. But the final one on this list is Sergei Edelman. He got a lot of attention in the 1980s. When he came to the U.S. in 1979, he was brought to the attention of RCA Victor by the widow of the pianist Alexander Brailovsky. So what happened is that under the producer John Pfeiffer's supervision, he began to make recordings for RCA in a very unpressured way without the goal of releasing them, just for him to get used to being in the studio. And there was a lot of press attention when RCA released his debut CD. It had a marvelous performance of the symphonic etudes, along with the arabesque and a wonderful toccata. Then there was an excellent Chopin disc with the B minor sonata. There was a coupling of the Schubert Wanderer Fantasy and Schumann C Major Fantasy. I've never heard that disc, believe it or not. Then there was a Beethoven disc with the Appassionata coupled with Opus 31 number 3. And then he recorded for RCA the 2 Mendelssohn concertos with Klaus-Peter Flohr conducting. Really, really fine disc. And he also did a terrific Strauss burlesque with Pavel Berglund conducting. Nobody ever talks about that recording. That's totally under the radar. But then nothing more for RCA. He basically faded from the label, or they dropped him. However, Sergei Edelman has had a distinguished teaching career both in the U.S. as well as Europe and Japan, and he has continued to record. And there are some excellent releases on the Japanese Triton label. There was a terrific Bach disc with the Chromatic Fantasy and Fugue and Italian Concerto, and he remade the Schumann Fantasy and Symphonic Etudes for Triton. I have not heard his remakes. He also did the Chopin Second and Third Sonatas, also for Triton. So, like André Michel Schub and Frederick Chu, Sergei Edelman continues to have a busy and fulfilling and multifaceted musical life. And for me, I think that's the most important thing in the long run, not to become a superstar after you get all this publicity from winning a competition or landing a contract with a record company. I think the best kind of musical career is when you have a diversified musical portfolio, rather than banking on being a superstar and putting all your eggs in one basket. I think if you just try to be the best musician you can be, and you keep up your game, and you grow over time, I think that's the best way to do it. So, in the case of most of the pianists I've been talking about, the whatever happened to question is answered with a positive outcome. In the case of Alexei Sultanov, he crashed and burned artistically and came to a tragic end health-wise. The Pogorelich story, come to think of it, it kind of parallels the creative path of that comedian Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce started out in the 1950s as a daring and provocative and controversial and highly charismatic performer who challenged the stand-up comedy norms and had tremendous influence, and everybody was talking about him. And then he just wound up becoming a bloated, ranting, obsessive, and eccentric caricature of himself. And of course, the drug use didn't help. As for Leonid Kuzmin, as far as I know, he's missing in action unless you tell me otherwise. And the same for François-René Duchable. What's up with him? Please fill me in if you know, listeners. And Naida Cole is a successful and highly respected anesthesiologist. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Thank you for tuning in to this episode, and I look forward to being with you next time.